I got to do something about that. Pedro, I got this at the last minute. Thanks. And so, what I was looking at, as everyone knows, in the news, we're inundated with information about a lot of brutality and the most extreme acts under the umbrella of self-defense, the need for protection, and feeling safe, with the justification that tends to come with it. And it is used to excuse all kinds of brutality. So when things like this happen, I tend to think about US history. And given the presentation that goes on today, I settled on the idea of policing as follows. The history of policing can be traced back to the days of slavery in colonial America. In the South, where slavery was central to the economy, slave patrols responsible for capturing runaway slaves and returning them to their masters was the first unofficial police in America. Slave patrols were especially cruel in the ways they captured runaway slaves and punished them for their daring escapes. Slave rebellions were a constant threat to the economic status quo of the Southern plantation owners, and slave patrols ensured that these owners were able to intimidate and punish any insurgencies or revolts in revolts. In return, wealthy plantation owners protected the interests of the slave catchers. As a result, this practice created a social hierarchy between the wealthy landowners at the top, the slave patrols separating the wealthy from the poor, and the slaves who were at the bottom of this hierarchy. These slave patrols slowly morphed into policing units in charge of breaking up insurgencies that began to rise in the aftermath of the Civil War. When the Civil War ended, many colonists, especially Southerners, felt threatened by the population of freedom African Americans, arguing that they would disrupt the social order. As a result, African American communities experienced an increase in violence committed against them in the form of police brutality. The Reconstruction era, which came immediately after the Civil War, was a racially charged environment as the newly freed citizens attempted to live peacefully among their oppressors. Additionally, reconstructing the South after the war would require a lot of free labor, and much of the Reconstruction that took place was achieved through the enforced hard labor of the newly freed populace, who were shortly enslaved again, this time through the prison system. Now, I use this as an example to be reminded that no individual or group has an exclusive claim to suffering and fear, and that we would all benefit from expressing the empathy and compassion that should come from accepting that essential truth. Thank you.
See, Solomon, you always do well, so you will be called back. Well, we're ready for our speaker, who today is one of our own, John Holmgren, who has volunteered counselor or whatever for many years at Butner Correctional Facility, and he will tell us all about it. Thank you, John.
Okay, give me a second here. There we are. So, welcome everybody. So what I'm going to focus on today, as the title tells you there, is what life has been like at Butner for the prisoners there, particularly during COVID from 2020, early 2020 up till now. So that's the primary topic. So what am I going to cover? First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the organization under which I visit the prison, which is Prisoner Visitation and Support. Then I'm going to talk just a little bit about how I got involved in this. And then I'm going to go into some publicly available data on inmate treatment in federal prisons. And finally, I'll move on to the firsthand accounts of the men I actually visit and what they tell me about what was going on during COVID. I wanted to do both of these last 2 points, the public data and what I'm told, for a couple of reasons. One is to try to verify independently some of the things I was told by them. And the other is to bring out a few things that probably aren't in the public record that I've learned from talking to the men I visit. So, okay, next item. What is PVS, or Prisoner Visitation and Support? So the mission of PVS is to provide prisoners with regular face-to-face contact from the world outside of prison to help them cope with prison life. Unlike most of the visitors to Butner, PVS visitors are tied to no religious entity. It's a strictly secular program. We talk about whatever the men feel like talking about. There's no restriction on the topic. There are only a few rules. I'm not allowed to ask them why they're in prison. If they choose to tell me, that's fine, but I can't ask them that question. And there are certain things they can't tell me without my having to report them. If they tell me they're planning an escape, I have to report. If they tell me they're planning violence towards other inmates or even towards themselves, I have to report that. But basically, as I tell them when I first meet with them, they're free to talk about anything they want. And I promise, with the exceptions I've already noted, that nothing will get reported back to prison officials about our conversations. So, okay. PBS was founded way back in 1968, and the original purpose was very different from what it is today. The original purpose was to go to military prisons to give support to conscientious objectors who had been in prison during the Vietnam War. But it didn't take long for visitors to discover that there were many, many other inmates who were very in being able to talk to anybody from the outside. So the mission of PVS got expanded in 1972 to include all inmates at all federal prisons. So today there are over 300 PVS volunteers. They see thousands of prisoners each year in 102 federal prisons plus 4 military prisons. Our program is supported by the Bureau of Prisons. They give them our blessing, and for that reason, we have access to every prison in the federal system. Okay, so that's PBS. How did I get involved with it? Back in 2009, when we were just started meeting here, there was a talk by a man by the name of Samuel Johnson. I don't know if anybody here heard that talk. I think some of you did, yeah. And he talked about the PBS program. And as a result of that, 4 people from EHST volunteered to meet with prisoners. Myself, Randy Best, Nancy Applegate, and a woman whose name I forget, and who has since moved to Chicago. Fran, and I can't remember Fran's last name. Okay, good. So that was back in 2009. So that was 14 years ago. I know in the introduction to my talk, as it was put on the website, it said 12 years. And I had thought I had started in 2011, but I pulled out an old computer and looked back at some old emails and discovered I actually started meeting with prisoners in 2009. So I visited steadily every month. I can't remember any months I didn't go up until 2000, the beginning of 2020. I visited, I told you I meet with 4 men each time I go, and it's the same 4 men as long as they're there and as long as they wish to continue meeting with me. But because of turnover, because of people being released or getting transferred, I visited a total of about 25 inmates over the 14 years I've been doing this. My last pre-COVID visit was in February of 2002. And in February, shortly after my visit, they shut down all visitation at Butner. And they didn't open it up, at least to PVS, until this year, until I made my first visit this past September. So for 3.5 years, I wasn't allowed to visit. Now, there was some limited visitation with relatives that was allowed in 2022. But for basically 2 years, pretty much all of 2020, all of 2021, and some of 2022, no inmate at Butner had a visitor of any kind. Now, the PVS program is aimed primarily at men who don't have visitors from their family or from friends. So most of the men I have met with over the years get very few other visitors. Many of them get no other visitors. I'm the only one they ever see from the outside. So anyway, that's how I got involved in this. And I found it a very rewarding program. I learn a lot. I enjoy talking to these men, and I ended up being amazed at the wide variety of individuals who are in prison. And even though not all of them tell me why they're there, some do. So since I'm visiting the low security branch of Butner, I don't meet with any prisoners convicted of violent crimes. Most of the men I meet with are convicted of financial crimes, drug offenses, and drug offenses dominates everything else. There are many more of those than anything else. And I also meet with some men who were there because of sexual crimes, because not rape, but most often the sexual crime is having child pornography on a computer, not engaging in direct pedophilia, but if you're caught with child pornography on your computer, you can get a very stiff sentence for that. And some of the men I meet with are there for that reason. Okay, enough about me. Now I'm going to go through 3 different data sets. The first set I'm going to talk about is from an NPR report that was done this last August. It was a report on inmate medical treatment in federal prisons in general. And by the way, at the bottom of each of the charts or each of the slides I'm going through, it's hard to see here, but there's a website there. And that's the site that was the source of the data I'm reporting. So there have been almost 5,000 deaths in federal prisons in the past decade. Out of more than 120 BOP federal prison sites, 25% of those deaths were at Butner. So that's well over 1,000 at Butner in the past decade. So what's the reason for that? Why is Butner have such a high death rate compared to the other prisons? Well, there are a few reasons. One is that Butner is one of the few federal medical centers in the prison system. So any prisoner with a serious illness will generally get transferred to one of the medical centers, and the medical center at Butner is the biggest one. So if somebody is terminally ill, they may well end up getting transferred to Butner, and hence all those deaths of terminally ill patients get credited, if you will, to Butner. That's the primary reason the death rate at Butner is as high as it is. The problem, as this NPR report was able to document, is when ill prisoners get sent to Butner for medical treatment, it's almost always too late. It's too late to be adequately medically treated. They often are in advanced stages of cancer. That's the primary source of death, by the way, cancer. And Butner doesn't have enough staff, medical staff, to handle the number of prisoners in the Federal Medical Center. And then because of COVID, delays in treatment got exacerbated, and COVID resulted in a lot of real medical problems. The medical center, and the prison as a whole, I should say, was not adequately ready for COVID. And when COVID hit, it took them way too long to come up with a decent medical plan for dealing with COVID. And by coincidence, all of Butner was badly overcrowded at the time COVID hit. The stated capacity at Butner is 4,100 prisoners. At the time COVID hit, they had 4,700 prisoners there. So they were badly crowded. I'll say more about that a little later. Let's move on to the second source of data. This is a 2020 report by something called the Marshall Project, and it focused specifically on COVID and specifically on Butner. The worst effects of COVID were felt during this period, during 2020. Things got better after 2020. I'll say more about that. But by July of 2020, already 94 federal inmates had died of COVID throughout the prison system. 24 of those were at Butner. Again, a much higher percentage than you would expect. And that wasn't as much due to the earlier reasons that I gave for high deaths at Butner. These were people who contracted COVID at Butner and died at Butner. So the COVID situation was much worse at Butner than most of the other federal prisons. Just some data that they reported here. 50 out of 4,700 Butner inmates were released during the period from the outbreak of COVID in early 2020 to this July date that they're reporting on here. So over a period of a little over 6 months, they released 50 prisoners. Now, Butner was releasing a lot less than most other federal prisoners. They only released about 1% of their inmates, whereas across the whole prison system, about 2.5% of the inmates got released during that period. And for reasons that are hard to understand, those 50 released inmates were not tested for COVID before they were released. And as a result, several of those released inmates tested positive upon arriving home or wherever they were going after release. And in at least one case, an inmate died on the flight home after being released. So he was already badly infected with COVID, and he didn't even make it through the flight back to his home. Then in June of 2020, all of the Butner inmates were tested. This was the beginning of a plan that the government put in place. Out of all of those inmates, and there were a little over 1,000, 60% of them, 642, tested positive. So what did the federal plan have to do with these with inmates? Well, there's something called SHU. SHU stands for Special Housing Unit. The Special Housing Unit at Butner is for disciplinary cases. So they're punishment cells. They're solitary confinement punishment cells. Now, most of the SHU cells had been closed before COVID, but because of COVID, they reopened them. So if you got tested for positive for COVID, in order to isolate you, they put you in SHU. And SHU is not a very pleasant place to be. Much higher security than the normal prison. And many inmates didn't want to end up there, so they would hide their symptoms as a result. Let's go back to the fact that 642 men had tested positive. What did they do as a result of that? Well, 9 days after that mass testing, when they finally had all the results of the test, they segregated the prisoners based on the outcomes of those tests. So they took the ones who tested positive 9 days earlier and put them in one portion of the prison, and those who did not test positive in another portion. Well, you can guess, because they waited 9 days, many of those who tested positive were fine. They had passed through the worst of COVID and were recovered. And many who didn't test positive 9 days earlier now were infected and were in fact positive. So that separation was next to worthless. COVID ran rampant through the whole population. All 4 of the men I met with had COVID, and pretty much every prisoner at Butner Low ended up with a case of COVID. So, okay, let's go on. One other set of data I want to talk about. There's something called the U.S. Sentencing Commission Compassionate Release Report. Back in December of 2018, as a result of the First Step Act, one of the few good things Donald Trump did, he signed that act. Courts were authorized to consider inmate motion for compassionate release, at least under certain circumstances. Before then, if you wanted to get a compassionate release, basically the warden at your prison had to put you in for it. And they put very few people in for compassionate release. Starting in late 2018, a prisoner was able to apply on his own to the BOP for release. And I'm going to give some data about what the result of that was. Give me a moment here. This is the report that I want to reference. This was done in September of 2022, and it covers the years 2020 through 2022, or through late 2022. Just a little data here. Just look at the top line. Well, that's a bummer. It's showing up here. Okay, I'm not sure why that's happening. Well, I'll just have to report the data to you. 25,000 during this 3-year period, really, 2020 to late 2022, over 25,000 prisoners put in for compassionate release. Many of them during the period of COVID in 2020. Of those, 4,232 were granted release, 21,182 were denied release. That's an 83.3% denial rate. So it isn't easy to get compassionate release, and I'll say more about that later. There's a chart I'm looking at here that you clearly can't see, but it shows that during 2020, there was a big spike in applications for compassionate release. It reached a monthly high in September of 2020 of over 2,000 applications in just that 1 month. And the number of individuals granted release also peaked in that same period. The highest it ever got, let's see, was in July of 2020, 400 prisoners were released out of 1,600 that applied. So that's about 4%. That's as high as it ever got. Then this chart shows that going into 2021 and into 2022, applications dramatically dropped. The average number of applications during late 2021 and into 2022 was somewhere between 400 and 500 a month. The denial rate was, I'm sorry, the percentage who were granted release, it averaged about 80 out of about 450. So, around 15% or so, I guess, I'm doing the math in my head. But since then, it's been very low. An example is, I'm looking for a chart here. It turns out that Butner lies in the 4th Federal Circuit Court District. And I have some data here from the 4th Circuit during that period. Across the whole 4th Circuit, 80.4% of the applications for compassionate release were denied. But it varied quite a bit across the 4th Circuit. In Maryland, only 67% were denied. Eastern North Carolina, 80%. Middle North Carolina, 94% denied. Western North Carolina, 96% denied. It turns out that Butner, even though geographically it doesn't fit, Butner gets lumped in with the Eastern District, which has actually the best compassionate release data of any part of North Carolina. Okay, so that's enough data, and I'm sorry you can't see those slides. Let me go back to the presentation. And let me move on now to some first-hand accounts with the men I visited. Again, I meet with 4 men every time. The 4 I'm meeting with now range in age from 37 up to 65. And look at their release dates. The 65-year-old will be released in 2035, barring any compassionate release or anything like that. The guy 55 in 2033, guy's 44 in 2036, but all of these guys have a decade or more to go in prison. The exception is the youngest guy, 37. He gets released in 2025, which is less than 2 years from now. That is, given the lengths of some of these sentences, he's already, looking ahead to getting out. 2 years is nothing to these guys. All right. So I have to be a little careful about what I tell you about what they told me. I don't want to violate their privacy in any way, but I'll tell you what I know they would have no problem my sharing with you. First of all, according to all of my men, the Butner response to COVID was too little, too late. It was running rampant by the time the government did anything at all about it. When COVID hit, Butner Low was, like the rest of Butner, was overcrowded. There should be about less than 1,000 men in Low, and they were up to about 1,200, I think, or 1,300. In fact, it was bad. The crowding was bad enough that they took cubicles, which were designed for 2 men, and put an extra bunk in there to allow 3 men in. So many of the men during that period when COVID hit were in a cubicle with 3 men, which was never supposed to have more than 2. And the cubicles were small. I actually was given a tour once of their facilities. This is a low security prison, so these men aren't in cells. There are no bars. In fact, when you walk onto the grounds of Butner Low, it looks more like a pleasant community college than it does like a prison. But the cubicles, I would say, from my recollection, were about 10 by 10, approximately. And there are 3 men who are required to spend much of the day in those cubicles. Now, because Butner's low security, they get to spend quite a bit of time out of the cubicles, and there are activities that they are allowed to take part in. There are recreational activities. They can play baseball. They can play basketball. They can walk around a track outside their facility. So they have plenty of time for exercise. There's even a billiard table in there. They can play pool. But it's very crowded. So for instance, if you want to go and watch TV, you got to reserve a place. It's an informal thing. It's not a formal reservation, but it's well known which chairs belong to which guys. And you can't just walk in and sit down wherever you feel like it. But it's crowded. So I've already told you about the fact that in 2020, all the men got tested and how the inmates got segregated. And all of the prisoners knew how stupid this was. I mean, they knew from talking to their friends who was probably sick and who wasn't. And they knew that any attempts to segregate people to prevent the disease from spreading were worse than useless. So imagine a place that's already overcrowded. You're stuck with all these people 24 hours a day. More than half of them are already infected. And there's virtually no way you can avoid catching COVID. And all my men had COVID, all the 4 I meet. The worst case was my oldest inmate, the 65-year-old guy. He got COVID in May of 2020, and his symptoms were pretty bad by then when the doctors at the medical center at Butner looked at him. It was bad enough that they realized they couldn't treat him adequately, so they sent him over to Duke. And that's basically the overflow for the Federal Medical Center. If they can't deal with a problem there, the prisoner gets sent to Duke. When he got to Duke, they put him on a ventilator. He stayed on that ventilator in a coma for over 2 weeks. They had just about given up on him. They were pretty sure he was going to die, but he didn't. He did, however, lose 43 pounds, and he wasn't a particularly heavy guy to begin with. He went into kidney failure and was put on dialysis. But he finally got returned to the Federal Medical Center in early July. Remember, he caught COVID in May. He was at Duke for several weeks, some of those weeks on a ventilator, and then they sent him back to the Federal Medical Center in July. His bout of COVID left him with atrial fibrillation and only 30% heart function. So he's a very sick guy. He's 65. He wasn't 65 then, but he's 65 now. He put in for compassionate release. He was denied. Now here's a guy who's so sick that he can't possibly be a threat to anybody under any circumstances, but he was denied. And that happens to most of the applicants for release. Now, he's hopeful at this time because he turned 65 this year. And once you're over 65, based on the system used to decide who should get compassionate release, he gets more credit for being older. And 65 is an important cut point for that. But because he was denied compassionate release, he's gone to classes and he's become a paralegal. And in fact, he provides legal advice to many of the men at Butner and helps them write up their applications for compassionate release and helps them with other legal problems. So he's savvy enough that he's been able to file suit against the Bureau of Prisons to try to get reconsideration for compassionate release. And he thinks now that he's over 65, he might have a pretty good chance. But he's not all that optimistic, actually. Given the denial rate, it's still a long shot to get compassionate release from prison. So he had the worst experience with COVID. The other 3 men I had, none of them ended up getting sent to SHU, the special housing unit, partly because SHU itself got overcrowded. They had shoved too many people in there. So when somebody tested positive, they had a special wing they put the guy who tested positive in, and they had to go to a special wing of their housing facility. They their symptoms weren't that bad, and none of them had anything close to the kind of problems this 65-year-old guy had. But the situation was still pretty awful during that COVID period, particularly in 2020. For example, instead of hot meals, there were no hot meals of any kind from February 2020 until late August 2020. So that's February, March, April, May, June, July, about 7 months without ever having a hot meal. All they got was cold sandwiches for every meal. So, you know, they got breakfast cereal for breakfast, I think, but beyond that, for lunch and dinner, nothing but cold sandwiches. They did finally, at the end of 2020, begin vaccinating the prisoners at Low. And in fact, most of the men have had 2 doses. Most of them got one in December of 2020 and another in January of 2021. But several inmates have refused to have vaccines. The BOP can't force them to have vaccines. If they refuse, the government can't legally vaccinate them. And the reason they refuse, well, you know, there are people out in the general population, some of us know some of them who refuse. But at Butner, the reason for refusing is mainly a lack of trust in the BOP, in the Bureau of Prisons. So I was unable to find any data on the percentage of prisoners who have refused vaccination, but and it's not a majority by any means. The majority of the prisoners did, in fact, get the vaccine. Now, the attitude towards vaccine, when I talk to men, isn't that different than it is outside. Most people, most of these guys are educated enough to check data in magazines they have access to, in newspapers. They don't have access to the internet. That's one thing they can't get. But they were able to get enough data so that most of them became convinced that the vaccines were a good thing. In fact, some of the things of Butner have improved since COVID, and partly due to COVID. The overcrowding has finally been overcome. They've cut the number of prisoners in some of the units down drastically. So now they're under capacity. They're under the 4,100 total prisoners that is supposed to be the upper limit. They've done away with 3-man cubicles. In fact, the new warden, it's a woman, and I haven't met her, but she seems pretty good. In order to make sure they wouldn't try to go back to 3-person cubicles, she sent men in to actually take apart the double bunks and to remove the upper bunk and get rid of them. So it would be difficult to go back to 3-man cubicles. And they're back to normal meal cycles, which is good. They're back to normal almost normal visitation rules. They're not quite normal. It used to be the case that I could go pretty much any day of the week. And I could visit all 4 of my men when I went. Now visiting, until they decide otherwise, is limited to Saturday and Sunday. And the units that are allowed to have visitors alternate. So half the units can have visitors the first and third weekend, the other half the second and fourth. And unfortunately, of my men, 3 of them fall into one of those categories, 1 in another one. So right now, I can't meet with all 4, but I'm going back on the 18th, and I'm going to attempt it anyway. It's one of those cases of asking forgiveness instead of permission. I'm gonna ask that the guy be called out, the one guy who I'm not supposed to be eligible to see, and we'll sometimes the officers will go ahead and do it anyway. Yeah. So I might get lucky. We'll see. Yeah, right. So, okay. Some other things, I thought I had some other improvements here to their situations. But I can't think of any additional ones now. But all of the inmates, all 4 of the men I meet, tell me that things are much better now than they were, and they're pretty much back to normal, pre-COVID normal, and even a little better than pre-COVID normal, because that overcrowding actually occurred before COVID. It wasn't due to COVID. So as a whole, things are getting definitely better, but COVID showed how bad things were. There was something I had meant to say earlier. I want to go back to an earlier chart. Yeah, I forgot to mention this fact when I said that many of the a quarter of inmate deaths throughout the prison system are at Bettner. I forgot to mention the fact that Bettner actually lost its accreditation. Their certificate of accreditation as a medical center lapsed 2 years ago. They're trying to get it renewed, but they don't like anyone to advertise the fact that they have actually lost their accreditation. Anyway, I had forgotten to mention that fact. So other than that, I'm pretty much done. So any questions? Yeah, we'll do passing the pass. So while Gretchen's getting the baskets out, let me know.
Hang on a second.
Here comes the mic. By the way, both my batteries, my hearing aids have died.
Goodness.
So I might have to ask you to repeat the question.
So you mentioned earlier on that some number of people were in prison for drugs, and I wonder if, as I've heard, a lot of those might be for a possession of marijuana, and I also heard there was a movement since then to release some people that just had possessed marijuana. Did that affect the staffing and the loads of people at the prison? Did you have many there that were there for marijuana and got released, or didn't?
Personally, among the prisoners I visited, I haven't met anybody who was there because of marijuana and only marijuana. Usually they get sent to a federal prison, not for possession, but for dealing drugs, selling drugs. I like I say, there may be men at Butler who are there for marijuana only selling, but I personally haven't met her.
I mean, in general,
The prison, the crimes they told me, those bad ones. One of the guys I met with for a long time, one of the first guys was in there for check kiting. He was very good passing false checks.
Hey, John.
Any technical?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Assume people can't hear you. That's
Yeah, I'm sorry. So this one guy I was meeting with was very proud of how good he was at check kiting. And he was mad at himself because he made a stupid mistake and got caught. And that was the only thing he felt bad about. But I've met with a few prisoners there for possession of child pornography. And they have the hardest time of any prisoners at Butner Low. They're looked down upon by other prisoners. When they get released, the rules for compassionate release make it very hard for them to get released. And in fact, if they're under 65, they probably got no chance at all of getting a compassionate release, no matter what their health situation is. Once they are released, they are identified as sexual predators, and they have to report to the local authority. If they apply for housing anywhere in the community, they have to tell who's ever about to give them housing that they're on the sexual predator list. So it's very hard for them to get housing once they're released. It's a very, very tough situation for them. Actually, not that, even though drug possession is far and away the single most common crime committed by the men, not drug possession, I'm sorry, drug dealing is the biggest category of crime at Butner Low. I don't see a lot of the drug dealers, and that's partly because drug dealers usually carry guns and are usually convicted not just of dealing, but of violence in some way. And so they don't end up at low. So the drug dealers, most of them are in the medium and high security parts of Butner. The low security dealers, there are some at Butner Low, but not as many as you would expect. Anyway, any other questions?
Yeah, I got two over here, but
Okay.
I'm gonna jump in and ask one
Sure, go
real
ahead.
quick. What is the typical topic of discussion when you meet with these
That's a good
folks?
question. And there is no typical topic. It is highly variable depending on the individual. Some guys want to do nothing but talk about how things are going in prison, what's happening, what they're trying to do to get out, all these other things. Other men are just the opposite. They do not want to talk at all about their prison life. All they want to talk about is their life before prison, what they're hoping for in their life after prison, but they don't want to talk about being in prison at all. So there's sort of a dichotomy there. The one commonality among all the guys, I'll ask a few prompting questions just to get our conversation going, and they take it from there. I don't have to say much. I spend 80% of my time listening to them. Again, the topics can vary widely. I have one guy who learned I owned a Tesla, and he wanted to talk for hours about Teslas and electric vehicles. I've had guys who talk a lot about their families and their contacts with them. But most of the guys I talk with have very little contact with their family. They don't get visits from them, but their contact is primarily through mail and phone calls. And that's because this is a federal prison, it's more likely than not that their residence is quite a ways away from Butner. And it's a difficulty for their relatives to come and see them. And there's a strange regulation that the BOP has. If you are arrested in a particular city, let's say the city of Philadelphia, and you get sent to prison, when it's time for you to be released, you will be sent back to Philadelphia unless you can prove that you've got an offer of living accommodations, usually from a relative. And many of the men are able to go back home and live with family. But I've also met many who are not. So I'm one of the 4 guys I'm dealing with now, the guy who's going to get out in 2025. He's very worried because they're going to send him. He was arrested in Phoenix, I believe. They're going to send him to Phoenix, but his family's in Oregon. But because of family reasons, he can't. They can't offer him a place to stay, a family place to stay. So he can't demonstrate that he has somebody he can stay with in Oregon. So they're sending him to Phoenix. He knows nothing about Phoenix. He just happened to be there when he got arrested. But that's the rule. That's the federal rule.
So what was the reason they were able to cut back on the overpopulation, other than did enough of them die from COVID, or
It wasn't
since
due to COVID deaths. It was due to transfers.
Oh.
Because Butner was badly overcrowded and some of the other of the 120 federal facilities weren't, they transferred a whole bunch of prisoners because they realized that, you know, part of the problems they had during COVID was this terrible overcrowding. So they realized they had to do something about that, and they did.
John, thank you so much. About COVID, what about the staff? I mean, both the regular prison staff and the medical staff and cooking staff. There must have been a lot of low staffing during that time also.
There was a lot of the staff had COVID. A few of the staff at Butner died of COVID. And yeah, that was a problem. But did you mention, I didn't quite hear you. Did you mention masks? Was that what you said?
I did not, but I was wondering about it.
Yeah, well, there was never universally mandated mask wearing. There never was. And when they did distribute masks, they were muslin masks, which were next to useless. So.
I'm just wondering, so with these prisoner visitation services to visit prisoners at the Butner, for example, do you have to be male to be a visitor of male prisoners?
No, Nancy Applegate was a visitor.
Okay.
And that's Butner's all males, by the way. There are no women there. What you have to go through is the FBI does a criminal check on you to make sure you're not a bad guy. And you have to go through a training session. I think there were 3 sessions I had to go through to get trained on the PVS expectations of you. And then I have to go to an annual renewal training every year. In fact, I was just there this past Friday getting my annual renewal. And that's about it. We're badged volunteers, which means when we show up to go into the prison, we ask by number. I'm 96 for our badge, but we're escorted volunteers. So we can't wander in on our own. We have to be escorted in by one of the prison officers. But the badge does give us certain privileges. A normal visitor, when a normal visitor shows up, they have to fill out a fairly long form saying who they're visiting, what the reason for the visit is, what their health status is, a bunch of other stuff. I am spared that. Usually. Every once in a while, though, I'll run into a new officer who isn't familiar with PBS, and they make us jump through hoops. I learned many years ago that it is not a good idea to argue with them about anything. If an officer says, these are the rules, have always been the rules, and I know that's not true because, well, example is a wristwatch. I always go in with my wristwatch. But once, this was pre-COVID, guy said, no, you can't go in with a wristwatch. And I said, well, I always have. He said, no, not allowed. And it's always been that way. You've never been allowed to take a watch in. And I said, okay, fine. So I go to my car and put my watch away and come back rather than argue. Arguing just gets them angry and makes them make up more rules for you to follow. So you got to be careful. Oh, but one of the things PBS volunteers are able to do, which no regular visitors can do, I can go in with pen and a notepad to take notes. A regular visitor can't do that. I can't bring any food in of any kind, but I can buy them food at their soda machines, and they used to have machines with sandwiches. Those are shut down. I don't know if they're ever going to start them again, but you can get candy bars and chips and things like that. And I usually get something for each of my men when they come and visit me. I'm sorry? Oh, no cell phones. Absolutely not. No, that's a real no. And that's where this watch situation came from. When they started introducing smart watches, that created an issue. You can't go in with a smart watch. I can go in with a regular watch, a regular analog watch, or even a digital watch, but not a smart watch. Any other questions?
Yeah. John, I've often wondered, now I'm not asking you to speculate, but you know the inside probably better than any of us ever will be. Do you think that any significant percentage of the people, of the inmates in there might actually be innocent? Have you known any that claim to be innocent?
Well, that's a good question. And I honestly don't know. Of course, many of them will claim to be, but I was told that even before I started visiting, that I was told you have to take with a grain of salt what you're told about that. I had one guy who was, well, let me back up. There are quite a few people at Butner, partly because it's a medical center, that have mental issues. I had one guy who was very articulate. I enjoyed talking with him, but he was off the wall mentally. He swore, for instance, that you know the song "She Wore a Yellow Ribbon." No, not "She Wore a Ribbon." I tie a yellow ribbon on it. He insisted he wrote that. And you know, I gave him the benefit of the doubt, and I went home and checked, and no, he did not write it. He insisted he owned a small island off the coast of South America, and it went on and on. He had a whole range of interesting stories to tell me. I think he just liked to talk, and he liked the fact that I appeared interested in what he was telling me. So he just made stuff up out of whole cloth all the time. Yeah, so getting back to your question, there may well be some prisoners who are in fact innocent of the crimes they were convicted of. But even the prisoners, they tell me it's probably a small percentage. The ones who are willing to talk about the crimes that got them there, none of them have denied it to me. Now, there are prisoners who will not tell me why they're in prison, but have said to me that, you know, I shouldn't be here. I didn't do what I'm here for, but they don't tell me what they're there for. So I don't think, particularly in federal prisons, I don't think there are that many who are innocent. State and local facilities, that's another question. But to get convicted of a federal crime, you're up against some pretty strong evidence, generally speaking.
John, I'm wondering, about the R word. Did religion ever come up?
Yeah, I generally don't say anything about my religious upbringing or about my current views unless they ask me. If they ask, I'll tell them. I have met with guys who are highly religious, who, I ask, one of the things I often talk with the prisoners about is what they're reading now. And for some of the guys, it's strictly religious, their Bible and religious tracts of other kinds. They're firm believers. I have not run into anybody who got upset when they found out I was a non-believer. Usually they're interested in learning more about it. But what often happens is once they find out my attitude, they stop talking about religion. Yeah. So, but yeah, there are a lot of very religious guys in prison.
I hope you haven't already covered this and I missed it, but are they allowed to access the internet in prison? Are they aware of?
Absolutely
Okay, so they're not aware really of.
The BOP goes way out of its way to make sure they can't do that. That's what I was trying to think of earlier when I said had been some other improvements, and I just forgot this one. Some years ago, just before COVID, they started selling at their commissary MP3 players, and you could buy music off a list of available songs, and it's a pretty wide list. There aren't many restrictions. There aren't many songs that they don't allow on the list. And then during COVID, I think it was earlier this year, I just found out about it when I started visiting again. They offer them tablets. And what can they do with these tablets? They can watch movies. They can rent movies that they watch on the tablets. There are games they can play. But I asked them, well, can you put books or audiobooks on your tablet? No, they're not available. Even though they have a library, and it would be technically, trivially easy to offer ebooks.
Yeah.
They haven't done that yet. Why? I asked them why, and they said, I don't know, they just don't want to give them to us. And the other thing they don't have is any kind of word processor on that tablet. So they can't write letters or anything. And most of them really want that. They would like to be able to write letters on their tablet and get them printed out, but not allowed.
So they're very isolated from the outside world. Do they ask you a lot of questions about, what's happening outside?
Yeah,
currently?
some, but they
Can they watch TV?
no, pretty much. They get magazines. Some of them have newspaper
Oh, okay.
subscriptions. They watch a lot of TV, so they get local news that way. So no, they pretty much know what's going on. For the most part. What? I think I've got a question back here.
Well, thank you for all the information. And I have a young man who's in juvenile detention, just someone that happened to someone I knew was concerned. This
I'm
person.
in a little trouble here.
Oh,
Could you
sure.
Speak up a little.
It's my voice. I tend to do that. Okay, so I just know someone I'm kind of a pen pal with a young man who's in juvenile detention that I do not know. He had just was a situation where he didn't have anyone, and he was sentenced to 9 years as a young man, and was one of those stories where he was in jail for a year waiting for a trial, all those kinds of things. What I am able to do for him is I can send him books from Amazon. It has to come directly from Amazon.
That's right.
And he does have a tablet, and there's an app that this center uses that I can communicate with him, basically text to him. It goes through a process. It's like multi-day delay because they read all the messages coming in and out.
Right.
And much like the question that was asked earlier, my I have this like difficulty trying to come up with things to talk about that's not like I took this great trip or what was your day like today. We've done things like shared a book, like read, kind of had like a book thing where we talked about a book. But I've been communicating with him for 3 years prior to COVID, actually, and he's still got, years left. He'll be 26 when he hopefully exits. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on just how to be, how to grow this relationship and be helpful to this
Right.
person so that when he's 26 and out in the world, he's gotten the most that he can get out of this.
That's a very good question. And in fact, that's why they call PVS prisoner visitation and support. Our role is, among other things, to try to help these guys be better prepared for the outside world when the time comes. The BOP does not do a good job of preparing these guys to get released. They used to do a better job some years ago, but a lot of the programs that used to be available have fallen by the wayside, generally due to lack of funding. Our Congress, unfortunately, is responsible for some of that. But I have found among the 25 or so men I've met with, there are some men that I have much more difficulty communicating with than others. That might be due to a lack of common experiences that we share. But some men just aren't as talkative as others. I find most of my men, though, are very talkative, but I've had a few that I had to work at trying to find subjects that they would enjoy talking about. The guy I had the most difficulty with was a guy who had been in prison for quite a few years. And, after months of trying, we both realized we weren't just finding any common ground to talk about. And he was the only one of all the people I've met with who actually suspended PVS visits as a result. I think you're doing a lot of the right things. Talking about books they've read or that I've read and they haven't can often be a useful thing and something they enjoy talking about. A lot of the guys like to talk about entertainment, about movies they've seen, and what I want to know what I think of this. Have I seen that movie? What do I think of that? But if you're asking, with how many of these guys am I able to get under that surface layer, get under pleasant conversation, talk about things that matter? I would say with most of them, it eventually happens, but it can take months, even years. Some of these guys I have met with for the longest I met with anybody, I think, was about 5 years.
We're gonna
get to know a guy, even though you only see them once a month. After 5 years, you get to know a guy pretty well. And once they end up trusting you, it's easier to dig a little deeper about, for instance, how are you preparing yourself to get out of here? And, I'll always acknowledge with them, I understand the prison isn't helping you much. It isn't helping you get ready to go, but what are you doing for yourself? And one of the points I try to make to all of them is you should be doing something. If you can take some courses, that's a good thing to do. All of the men in prison are assigned a job. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. Not all of them. Most of the men are assigned a job. There are some because of their health situation who simply can't perform a job. But if they have a job to do, that helps quite a bit. Some of them learn a valuable skill. They learn HVAC, for instance, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And that's a skill that's of use to them on the outside. I have another guy who's become a pretty good plumber as a result of the training he received in the prison. I've had other guys who actually teach classes to other prisoners on subjects they might be interested in. I've run across accountants, for instance, guys trained as CPAs who came in with that knowledge and used their time in prison to help others learn about accounting. I already mentioned the guy who, yeah, okay. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, John. That was a great program. Do we have any announcements? Maura?
Just real quick, do not come here next week. We will not be here. We'll be on Zoom only. Todd has inspired me a little bit because he did a recent program about his path towards ethical humanism. So I'm going to do a little bit of a talk with that, but with a bigger focus in maybe getting other people who are on the session to talk about some of what they've done also. Because I pretty much think Todd's was so awesome that I can't compete. Regardless, it'll be on Zoom only next week and in person the week after.
Anyone else? Any other announcements? Okay. Oh, Jennifer.
Just a reminder, Change for Change is here. So if you have any extra change, please donate. We have Cora who offers food to the community to support folks who are in need. So thank you.
So I think we're ready for our closing words with Solomon. Oh, is there a book club? Oh, book club today after this meeting in the side room in the back.
Well, as usual, I may start these things a little intense, but I always like to finish more upbeat. And so I'm going to finish with a few inspirational quotes, which have no particular bearing on anything other than they're inspirational quotes. They're all short too, so this won't be long. First quote, Haley Williams, whom I don't know and didn't take the time to look up, but she's quoted as saying, "I'm going to be gone one day, and I have to accept that tomorrow isn't promised. Am I okay with how I am living today? It's the only thing I can help. If I didn't have another one, what have I done with all my todays? Am I doing a good job?" Ella Fitzgerald, just don't give up trying to do what you really want to do. Where there is love and inspiration, I don't think you can go wrong. I care about decency and humanity and kindness. Kindness today is an act of rebellion. Singer Pink. And lastly, from Maya Angelou, try to be a rainbow in someone's cloud.
Thank you, Solomon, for our open and closing words, and Mary for being our greeter, and Ben and Mel for the lovely refreshments we have waiting for us, and Mike for always putting the signs out. And our meeting is over, but our fellowship continues, and please enjoy our refreshments, and we'll see you in 2 weeks back here.